I've read a number of texts and stories that have tried to explain the physiology of dragons, but dragons are like blimps. That's a new one. The Flight of Dragons. This one's kind of exciting for me because this is my very first Patreon-sponsored review. That is right, if you go to my Patreon, you do have the option to actually flat out dictate to me, review this. Here's the first one. So this one I'm pretty sure was brought on by this particular patron, having seen my review of the Rankin Bass The Hobbit movie, which I grew up with and I love. And I had mentioned in some reply to comments on that I actually haven't seen The Flight of Dragons, which is basically the only major Rankin Bass release that I haven't seen, because I've seen The Last Unicorn and Return of the King, and I've even got the 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, the one with the mice that they did. I grew up on that too. But somehow this one passed me by. So I'm now gonna take a look at this one, and this one I completely missed. This was a direct-to-video release. So and at the time that happened, that actually was kind of a downgrade from The Hobbit, because The Hobbit was made for TV, but honestly, at the time, made for TV was a little bit more respected than direct-to-video was. And in some ways, the final result reflects that. I'll get to some of the other stuff in a bit, but in terms of, it took me a little while to cue into the visual quality of it, because it's not bad by any means, but it did take me a minute as far as getting used to it, because my standard for Rankin Bass fantasy is, The Hobbit, Return of the King, and, Last Unicorn is the best looking fantasy movie they ever made. And while certainly the backgrounds of this are incredibly reminiscent of those other films, to the point that I think they actually might have reused a few of them from some of those other movies, the characters are way less detailed. And that in and of itself is not a problem, but I zeroed in on that right away because the level of character detail was one of the things I really loved about how they approached those other films that I mentioned, and in a way that kind of offset the fact that the fluidity of the animation was not up to par with something like Disney or Don Bluth or, other major animated releases of the time. So for this to also, not have as fluid an animation, but also not to have the level of detail I've come to expect and get used to with Rankin Bass Fantasy, that took me a little while. I did get used to it by the end, so it's not a fault with the film by any means. It was just something that took me a little while to sort of get a handle on. I think overall animation quality is probably a little bit of a halfway meet between The Hobbit and that 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. It's kind of in the middle, both in terms of being a mix of the style from The Hobbit and the more cartoony design work, and also in terms of the fluidity of the animation. So story-wise, because I don't know how many people have actually seen this one, because like I said, I missed it. So as far as the story goes, we are dealing with this notion that dragons and magic are real and did exist in the world, but that whole side of the world is fading as technology and science is becoming more prevalent in the world. And in an effort to basically preserve that, you have these four wizards, these four brothers. And they, the green wizard, who's our main one, Coriolanus? I think it's Coriolanus, who is voiced by Harry Morgan of MASH fame. He has the idea to basically create a magic sanctuary where all the magical things will go to live, and they won't be at risk of continuing to diminish until they eventually just vanish and die. And his other brothers are on board with this, except for one of them. And that will be Omadon, who's the Red Wizard. He's voiced by James Earl Jones. Now, the Red Wizard doesn't want to go along with this because his particular kind of magic, which is basically dark magic and rooted in violence and death, His is not getting weaker as science grows more powerful. His is actually getting stronger, and rather than flee, he would rather push humanity in the direction of developing their science to the point that they destroy themselves with it. And we get glimpses of nuclear bombs, amongst other things. So he doesn't go along with this plan, and they can't enact it if he is fighting them on it. So it's weird and vague. Under the guidance of antiquity, which is sort of a god figure-ish thing, but sort of a vague sense like destiny is. It's weird. Coriolanus, he goes forward to the future to find a hero. It's not like he has to quest to find a hero. He's told this guy, but it happens to be a guy from the 20th century who is this kind of poor, kind of down on his luck guy who's obsessed with dragons. He's designed a game, and he's working on a book called Flight of Dragons. Named Peter Dickinson, who actually wrote the real book Flight of Dragons, which isn't so much a narrative as it is a general positing of how dragons might have been, and the movie takes its story from another. How this film came together is weird, and if you know where it's pulling its sources from, which I had to look all this up, it's oddly meta in a way. But anyway, so Coriolanus takes this guy, brings him back, and with the hope that, okay, you as someone who is from the world of technology, but also believes and is fascinated by magic, you can meet this middle ground, and you are the one who can defeat Omadon. And so then you have structurally a fairly standard quest narrative. You know, he gets some people to help him along the way. There's some complications. They get captured. They escape. They defeat the bad guy. The specifics as it goes along are a little bit odd, but I'm going to come back to that. So I mentioned some of the voice cast already, and they're all pretty good. Nobody blew me away, though. Harry Morgan has this odd quality to his voice that no matter what, he sounds like his voice is coming over a slightly scratchy radio. And it's funny, I used to think growing up, because I mean, I knew he was in MASH, but I knew him from things like the Apple Dumpling Gang. I used to think, oh, this is an older show. That's just a scratchy audio, not realizing that's just kind of how the guy's voice sounds. So that's just sort of an odd thing that, again, it's not a problem. It's just something that's weird for me to think on, and so it's weird hearing just his voice alone. So, like I said, the voice cast is all pretty good. John Ritter voices Peter, who is our hero, and he's got a good voice for the sort of sort of, you know, wonder, which I think is this movie's strongest aspect. It has a good sense of wonder in this world, and a good sense of for as kind of restricted as the animation is, certainly compared to some of Rankin Bass's other projects of similar scope, it does capture that sense of a fantasy world, and a wonderful one, and one that you kind of want to see more of, and you kind of want to enjoy, and Peter is sharing that with the audience, so that stuff comes across really well. James Earl Jones as Omadon. He's fine. I mean, it's James Earl Jones. His voice is amazing. It always is. He feels a little bit wasted because he's kind of only called upon to grumble and laugh. The performance that he gives is probably the best performance that this character is going to get, but he just, more often than not, somebody will say something and his reaction will just be, that's kind of it. That's like his go-to response to almost everything. As far as the side characters go, they're all good. We get a number of dragons in this, with mainly Gorbash, who is a dragon that it's something a little bit odd happens with him. like I said, I don't know how well known or frequently watched this is, so I don't want to talk too much in terms of spoilers, but there's kind of an interesting wrinkle as far as Gorbash goes. There's Smurgal, who's sort of the older, wiser dragon, who's mainly there to give exposition about how dragons work. And we do, and those are our heroic dragons. We do also have a scary, more intimidating dragon, and we get some interesting, scarier dragon imagery towards the end. I say scarier, like it. If you were worried at all about this scaring your kids, Smaug from the Rankin Bass version of The Hobbit is scarier than any of these dragons, even the bad ones. So I guess that's your benchmark. Now, overall, though, I came away from this going, I was kind of odd. Like I said, the quest narrative is pretty basic, and which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I get the feeling that this film was probably more deliberately aimed at a younger audience than their other fantasy films. Or at least, very pointedly so. Because I suspect, The Last Unicorn, The Hobbit, Return of the Kings, those were aimed at kids too, but they were also based off material that was, meant for people, either meant for people of all ages or meant for, an older sense of what a kid was, James R.R. Tolkien may have written The Hobbit for, in his mind, a 6-year-old, but his idea of what a 6-year-old could read and our current idea of what a 6-year-old could read, not the same thing. So this one really feels much more aimed at that younger group, and it meanders in some odd ways. And mainly, there's a lot of divergences just sort of going into and digging into, like, explaining the science behind dragons. And that's where my opening thing with the blimp comment comes from, because Peter, after having explained to him how dragons are able to fly, basically breaks it down on a scientific level and compares it to a blimp. And there's a number of other things that happen along those lines in terms of explaining, where their fire comes from and all these things. And it's not uninteresting, but it is kind of shoehorned in. You do sort of feel how the material from the book Flight of Dragons, offering explanations of how dragons could have existed, and the narrative taken from a story called The Dragon and the George don't blend seamlessly. It does often feel like we're gonna put the story on hold so we can get into the hows of dragon function. And initially I liked it. Initially when it had these little moments of this at first, and they first started cropping, I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. But then there is a middle section where they basically stop the story dead in order to have this protracted explanation of how dragons work. And again, it's neat ideas. They're not exactly seamlessly integrated, though. And the movie also has a little bit of an odd structure in that when there's lots of stuff that is kind of plot relevant that we don't see happen. Instead, we get told, oh, this just happened. Then we have a flashback to it happening. Like, even right up until the end. And that's odd. It gives the whole thing sort of a lack of forward momentum, which doesn't completely make the thing fall down, because in a way that does sort of feed into the lingering sense of, oh, let's just stay here. Because it is a cool world, but there's not a lot of forward push on this thing. There's sort of little bursts of, now we're moving things forward, and I was like, oh, well, let's talk about this, and here's what happened way back when. Some of the supporting characters are pretty cool. I actually rather enjoyed, there's a knight character who's very, stiff upper lip, cup of tea, and he's a lot of fun. I enjoyed him, although he's got a slightly creepy interest in the Princess Melisande, who really shouldn't be there. Like, as a function of the story. I mean, in terms of him specifically, as part of his flashback, he's like, I promised myself then that I would fall in love with her. He says this talking about how he met her when she was 5. That's creepy, dude. Even for 82, that's creepy. But Melisande as a character exists basically to be a prize at the end. It's not quite so blatant as like the quest is to save her, and if you save her, she'll give you a kiss. It's not quite it's not quite that level, but it's close. She's there strictly to be a romantic interest, but there's almost no development of that angle, so it's just kind of taken as a given. Here's the girl, our hero and her, they're gonna, yeah. Like, well, okay, are they gonna spend maybe a little more time together? Is she gonna travel with them so she gets to buy? No. But they'll end up together. Don't you worry about it. I'm like, not worried about it. I'm a little bit more concerned why you felt the need to put it in there. But it's a basic story, and it's a trope, and certainly much more at the time it was made than now. Very much a standard and an accepted trope that your hero gets a girl at the end. So, if I'm being fair, for the time that it was made, it was just a standard plot turn. Looking at it now, and in my case, without nostalgia, there's a way more interesting female character named Danielle introduced later who also does almost nothing, which is a shame because I kind of dug her. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is probably counts a little bit as spoilers. Again, this is one of those things that you would go back and watch to get a sense of just 80s fantasy and sort of dwell in it for a while, not so much for the plot turns. But if you care about the plot, sort of my overall thought is it's fun, and if you like this type of thing, if you like other Rankin Bass fantasies, it's definitely worth checking out. I would put it myself at the bottom of the Rankin Bass fantasy films that I've seen. So it's not as good as The Last Unicorn, it's not as good as The Hobbit, it's not even as good as Return of the King, which has some, I need to talk about that one at some point because that's an odd film, but it's still worth seeing. So there's your thing that you can take away before I get into the very end and some spoilers. So here we go. The way the villain is defeated is weird. I like the core concepts behind it, but I feel like they weren't properly seeded in order for this to feel like a proper payoff, as opposed to just a really weird way to defeat a villain. So the whole thing, in case you have decided you don't care about spoilers, but you still haven't seen the film already, is that Omadon, he goes all out, and in one of the cooler visuals of the piece, basically sort of his back emerges and all these dragon heads, he like kind of turns into a hydra in a way, but not completely, because his own head is still like in the chest of this thing. It's an odd look, and it's kind of cool. And the way Peter defeats him is basically by saying, yeah, I don't believe in you. Like seriously. Says, I deny you. Here's a bunch of science facts. And Omadon starts to lose power and vanish and dies. Which is weird in and of itself, and feels like it would have worked better in a narrative that was a dream, like flat out, as opposed to something that is supposed to be as real as a fantasy story is intended to be. But in addition to that, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense in terms of what the film has already said, because at the beginning, the reason Omadon's a problem is he's saying that man's world is making him stronger. So why is the introduction of science and these concepts weakening and killing him? If it was capable of that, why was he claiming to be getting stronger by man's darkness? It doesn't... I feel like the rules aren't properly laid out. And actually, coming back to that, I mentioned antiquity and the whole thing. Antiquity, I think they try to pass it off a bit like the Force. Like, it's the will of antiquity. Don't question antiquity. Like, the number of times antiquity gets said, first of all, it's like, oh God, just stop saying it. But beyond that, it feels like a catch-all excuse, a big old hand wave to just try and explain away anything that doesn't make sense, because there's a fair amount of stuff that doesn't make sense, and there's a lot of stuff that's pretty arbitrary, like the fact that Omadon says, yeah, well, I'm not going along with this, and Coriolanus is all like, well, I will defeat him, and his brothers go, you cannot, such is the law of antiquity. Is like, oh, how convenient that this thing we're never going to get a proper explanation from is going to make it so the most logical thing to do to deal with this is something we can't do. So let's go on this, weird, twisty, grab a guy from the 20th century quest thing. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just what it comes across as is lazy writing and just finding a catch-all to explain all the things that don't really make sense. And again, as far as defeating the villain this way, it's not an awful idea, and I actually kind of enjoy stories where characters, they require belief to be powered, whether it is specifically fear that powers them or just belief in general. I do find that interesting when it's done well. I feel like it's not a concept that is properly fleshed out here. They just kind of drop it in as a way for him to be defeated at the end. It's not completely out of nowhere, but as far as how this world is, how this quest specifically is functioning, it feels like we should have gotten some reminders of it, because it's basically brought up as the initial problem. People aren't believing in magic, so magic's getting weaker, and then only comes back at the end, whereas the whole middle is just us existing in this fantasy world where, oh yeah, magic works and magic is real. So it felt like we needed a reminder of that. It needed to come up in the plot again, but it didn't. So that was odd to me. But again, to come back to what I said before, if you haven't seen this, it is worth seeing. It's an odd experience for me because watching this, which is a film I have no specific nostalgia for, I have to wonder if my experience of this would be similar to someone watching The Hobbit for the first time, which obviously I have a ton of nostalgia for and I love and I will happily defend. And I have a feeling there's probably a lot of people who grew up on this and are going to defend some of the criticisms I've made down in the comments because they have nostalgia for it. Because nostalgia is a very powerful thing. And it does make me think that sometimes perhaps I let myself get a little blinded by it when I talk about things I grew up on. But I'm not going to stop doing that. That's just how it is. But that's The Flight of Dragons, first ever Patreon-sponsored review in the can. Hopefully me not completely loving it doesn't dissuade people from following suit, and I'll get to do more of these in the future. We'll see what happens. In any case, The Flight of Dragons. Have you seen it? What did you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There's all the stuff to do. I mentioned in my Patreon, I got t-shirts. There's Twitter and podcasts. Links for everything down in the description. And until next time, this council is adjourned.